Hi there and welcome to my Belsay Arch textile kit. I'm really excited to bring this kit to life and I thought just before we get started with the tutorial I would tell you a little bit of the story behind the Belsay Arch kit. Belsay has long been an English heritage site that I really enjoy with the family and it's local to me as well. And in the autumn of 2022 I entered a Belsay design competition to design a new product for their brand new lovely gift shop refurb. And I won, and it was just a wonderful process to go through, and it's been great working with English Heritage to bring the kit to life as well. So it was developed from a textile original that I'd done a couple of years ago, and I think the competition was a really great way to kind of see if I could bring that textile original to life as a kit that someone could then take away as you've done yourself, and enjoy a little bit of sewing post Belsay visit, if you like, at home. So without further ado, let's get started. So first of all, I'd just like to say thank you for buying one of my Belsay kits and welcome along to the video tutorial. The photograph that features in this video is actually printed onto cotton, and it's one of my photographs that I took when I was at Belsay Gardens a little while back. So it's one of my family photographs, and I tried to snap it at a time of year when there wasn't too much greenery and bloom around the arch, so I could see more of the stone than the plants, because the idea with this kit is we're going to put some of the foliage in and the garden detail. So this video is really designed to run alongside the instructions that you'll find in your kit. And as with all of my kits and all of my teaching, I don't really try and encourage you to create a carbon copy of what I've done, but to equip yourself with the skills and the knowledge to be able to create something of your own, something really unique. So the video is also designed as well to really help you try and get the bones of this together. It's a useful talk through, and you'll be ready by the end of this video to get started with your hand embroidery, which I also talk through as well. Again, sitting alongside the instructions and the stitch guide in the back of the instructions too. So the first thing we need to do is we need to take the photograph and get that onto the linen base, so we're ready to start our fun bit, which is the textile collage. So the first thing we're going to do is pop the linen base over the curtain bump. I use bump quite a lot in my work because it just acts as a nice stabiliser, especially when you're working with vintage linens. You can see I stitch right through the back, but it means that work becomes quite, I don't know, quite substantial. But it's nicer to sew into when it's got a little bit of something behind it. And it can often give a little bit of a quilted effect as well. So curtain bump is my go-to for stabilising vintage fabrics. So bump down, pop your linen over the top. You might find there's a small crease in the middle because they've been folded in the kits, but that should all get covered up once we get going. Pop that to one side, and then we need to get the bondo web onto the back of the printed photograph. So the first thing you must remember to do is to peel off the paper backing. We don't want to put bondo web onto that paper, we need the paper off there first. So just peel that away and discard that. And the bondo web is 9-on glue, so one side of the glue, if I can get this in the light, is shiny and it's got a little bit of a texture to it, and the other side is just flat paper. So you need to put the textured side down onto the back of the photograph, I was going to say fabric there, and then just give it an iron, just a hot dry press for a few seconds. And that's now backed onto your photograph. Okay, don't peel the paper back enough just yet though. The next thing you need to do is cut out the arch. Now, you've got a couple of choices here. When I've done mine, I've cut out the arch completely. So you can see there, I've managed to put a little bit of collage behind it. But you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You can just keep it as the arch. You can keep it as an entire photograph and you can work from that. But if you do want to have a go at cutting the arch out and then piecing some little bits behind it so you can give the impression of a little fabric garden behind the arch, what's through the arch, then I would cut the arch out as well. And I also cut away this white part of the sky as well, because it's very sort of white, but it's quite nice to see that edge of the top of the arch as well. And I'm just going along in a sort of a rough motion just to try and get the texture of the top of the arch. Now I'm going to chip away at those plants as well, but you don't have to. Again, it's up to you how you would like to do it. So you've got you can see now you've got more of a rough edge. So you could just use it like that. You could just use it with the arch. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here just where the stone starts by the path. You could even leave the path in if you wanted to. Again, it's entirely up to you, but I'm going to go with what I've got on the example in the kit so you can see how I've done it. And I'm just going to cut away as close to the stone as I can. And the great thing about having the Bondo web on the back is that it acts as a bit of a fray check as well. That glue that's ironed on means that the edge of the fabric won't fray. So you can cut quite close to it. You could even leave that big green bush in if you wanted to. I've cut away with mine because I've covered mine in fabric. So I'm just going to snip away at that because I'm going to add the detail in later on with a piece of dark green fabric. And just cut that arch out. And you'll find because it's got the paper Bondo web on the back as well, it's easier to cut. It's not flimsy. It feels quite sturdy because it's got that extra layer on. So now you've got your arch, and that's back to Bondo web. If you have cut the centre of the arch out, keep that because you might actually be able to use some of the interesting detail from the middle of the arch in your textile collage later on. So don't discard it. You never know how these things can come in useful. And what you need to do now is get the arch onto the fabric. So you just need to peel the paper back and off. Easier said than done when you don't have really long nails. Usually it'll just crack off a little bit at the bottom. You can hear there the stick when it comes off. So then you peel that paper backing off, and you'll notice that the back of your printed photograph is sort of shiny and it's got the texture of the Bondo web on it. And then you can put that in place. Now I don't always put mine bang in the centre because I think one of those lovely things about composition is that things look better when they're slightly off centre, and also if your arch is ever so slightly off centre, then you can make a more meandering path that kind of comes out a little bit, and that helps to suggest perspective. So I would just either whether it's over to the left or the right, I would just make it ever so slightly off centre. So that's mine there, off centre. It doesn't look massively over to one side, but just a little bit off to the right. And if you can iron this down now if you've got the middle piece in still. So if you used a photograph like this and you haven't cut the arch away, then I would just iron this down straight away. If you've cut the arch out like I've done, I wouldn't iron it just yet because we're going to do the first layer of textile collage, and that includes getting some little pieces behind the arch. So we don't want to bond this in place and then not be able to slot some fabric just behind there. So if it's in place, hold your horses with the iron. We'll iron it in just a few minutes when we've got these little bits in the background. It looks a really complicated textile collage, this. Now, you know, granted it has got a lot of pieces on it, but if you approach it in layers, it's a bit easier to tackle. So the first thing I always look at is I've got my arch down, but it's not ironed in place. The first layer is to put something behind this arch, and then we're going to look at the size of the arch and the path. So we're going to forget about all of the greenery to start off with and just use those beige and brown fabrics for the stonework and the path with a little bit of green behind the arch. Now when I do textile collage, I don't really cut specific shapes. I try to approach it in a way where I'm cutting the fabric as if it was paper. I treat it almost as if it's a torn tissue paper collage. So there aren't you know, really set shapes to use when you do this collage. The first thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to add in a little bit of green behind the arch, just to suggest that there's some trees and plants and shrubbery just underneath the arch, under the walkway. So when I do some collage, I'll move this that way so you can see, I use the back of my blades, and I'm not really cutting a shape as such. I'm going to put the fabric to the back of my blades, and then I just pull and I make really small cutting motions. And what that does is it gives that little torn effect, and I pull as I cut, and I get these nice little wedge shapes. And they do look more like torn bits of fabric. And that's another thing that helps to add to the texture of these pieces as well. So I'm just going to do a couple of little slivers, these little bands and strips of colours. I'm going to do an ever so slightly more rounded one as well, just to suggest there's something going on beyond the arch. So I won't put lots of stitch on this either because it's something that I'm trying to sort of say is in the background. So more of the heavy stitching will go on the front and this will be a little bit more left as it is. So you can see there, because this isn't ironed down, I can place that collage in. And you can just about, I would say, a quarter of the way up this blank piece here, start putting in the greenery there, because that's where the path would probably stop. And the greenery would start, because if you go to Belsay, you find that path sort of goes to the right a bit as you go through, doesn't it? It sort of meanders a very little bit. It's actually quite a nice view if you go through the arch and look back on it as well. That's something I hadn't really realised until recently. Now I've cut that out there, so I've got 3 bits. So 1, 2, 3, and that's just to suggest something is in the background. And again, I wouldn't quite iron down at this point yet, because you can now suggest a path here as well. And again, because we cut this piece out, if we iron it down, we can't tuck things underneath the printed photograph. And you can see once you tuck them underneath how it starts to take a little bit more shape. So I'm going to take one of the beige fabrics, just a light colour, and I'm going to do the same thing again. So just using the back of my blade and small cutting motions, I'm just going to cut some more little wedges of fabric. So using a little bit here, and use a couple of different colours. There's my lightest one as well. A little bit of a contrast is quite nice. So I'm going to pop the straight edge up so it looks like the path is something that's man-made next to these lovely organic structures. And again, just layering that up, tucking it behind the photograph. Now the rest of it can probably be done in a little while, but it's just making sure that we've got those bits behind the photograph just to start off with. You might not have to cover the whole thing, because you'll find if you put some green in there for this big bush, as I've done there, it actually covers up the bottom part of this photograph. So you could put a little bit of something in, but if you don't worry. It's probably going to get covered in more lovely greens. So at this point now, I would iron this down. And I think whenever you're doing any work with creative textiles as well and printed photographs, it's always a good idea just to pop a tea cloth over the top before you iron it. And again, just a hot dry iron, a few seconds, will bond the glue on the back of the photograph in place, down onto your base fabric, and it'll also trap those fabrics and then put under the arch as well. So that's your first step, if you like. And now you can see now if I pick that up, that's in place. You've got a little bit of movement there because I haven't quite caught at the bottom. Give it another iron. There's a little bit of movement in those collaged fabrics, but they are by and large held in by the Bondo web for now anyway, until we start pinning and sewing. Let's give it a bit more of a press. So just hot dry iron for a few seconds. And as I say, it's always a good idea to cover it. Some of these collage fabrics have a little bit of a viscose content, so I wouldn't want anything that's got a man-made content and it's sticking to your iron and plate or marking your work as well. So tea towel is a good idea just to cover it. Okay, so that's the photograph in place and the first part of the textile collage done. The next thing we need to look at is collaging in around the arch and the path. So as the arch is a man-made structure, I'm a little bit more structured with my cutting for this one, but it's still very simple. It's just in the form of 2 strips. So without using the whole of this strip of fabric, maybe just cut about 2/3 down, so you've still got a little bit of that lovely grey beige left over. I just cut a couple of strips and put those down either side of the photograph. And they don't have to meet the top of the photograph either, because you can collage other bits of fabrics around this, but this just kind of blocks out some of that white for now. You can overlap it a little bit if you want to. Actually, that one's thinner, I think I'll put it on that side. You can overlap it a little bit if you want to, but we are sort of trying to extend from the photograph, so try not to leave any white between the two, just a slight overlap. Should be enough. Pop those in place. And then what I start to do, I'll show you the original here, is I start to cut out little rectangles, just little oblongs of different sizes and different textures, and trying to suggest some of the bricks that are in the arch. So it's not a exact science. I'm not lining up with the lines of the mortar and the brick there in the arch. I'm just suggesting that this is a man-made structure. So these bits of textile collage are a little bit more uniform than the bits which are more organic. So we've got that nice mixture of organic and man-made in the collage. So using your beiges, so I would pick out the darker grey, the Hessian, the tweed, and maybe this sort of more pinky beige. I kind of leave the white one for the path. I would start cutting out some little squares and rectangles, snipping away and just making that become a bit interesting, a bit textured. So we start getting those arch pieces together. You can make some of these pieces overhang. You can see with my piece there, I've made mine quite deliberately overhang, and then I actually cut the edges away at the end to really make it textured. But more on that later. But don't be afraid to let these pieces overhang and also just come into the arch a little bit as well. So you really blend in the difference between printed image and fabric collage. And just overlap them just ever so slightly. They don't have to be completely covered. I think the beauty of it is actually to let some of the photograph come through and to let it be a little bit blended here and there. And you'll realise already that we're starting to get lots of little bits of fabric that we work with. So a little tip, and I think this is on the back of the kit box as well, is that if you've got a Pritt stick, you can Pritt stick these in place instead of pinning, because I appreciate that it takes a lot of pins to pin this in place. And that can sometimes, it can get hard on your fingers, and you can actually see your work a little bit better if you've got, if you haven't got as many pins in your work. Sorry, trying to talk while I'm cutting out. So I wouldn't normally be an advocate of gluing anything on fabric while I'm sewing. I know some people might be watching on in horror as I mentioned Pritt stick. And when I was a teacher in schools, I used to hate Pritt stick because everything that people, stuck down in their sketchbooks using Pritt stick by the end of the year would be falling out of the sketchbooks because it's a very dry glue. It's not very permanent. However, for this sort of project, it actually has its uses because it's so thin and because it's not permanent. So instead of using pins, if you want a temporary hold so you get it flat, you can just put a little bit of Pritt stick on the back of your work. So if I was going to cut another little piece out of here, you could just pop a little bit of Pritt stick on the back and stick it down. And that would do the job. That would do the job fine. It's because it's temporary and because it's not as thick as PVA glue and it's not going to hold in place and then form a really solid PVA glue layer that's then hard to sew through. So that's just a little handy tip. And I was told about that a while ago and sort of road tested it for this project in particular because there's lots of little pieces on it. And it worked quite well actually. It holds the fabric in place for when we need to stitch it later on. But if you do want to just pin instead, then by all means go ahead and just pin. I did a mixture of both, to be honest. I found it easier to pin these pieces and then I started gluing really small bits later on. That's a handy tip. Don't feel guilty if you want to use a little bit of Pritt stick. So you can see there are lots of little pieces, but we're starting to blend a bit. I might not do much more than that because there's going to be more things going on top as well. So for me, that's enough kind of brickwork. That's those bricks pinned in place now. I know it's really tempting to think about doing the whole collage, putting the path in, putting all of the green bits in for all of the foliage and the garden detail. But I think because there's lots of little bits in this this particular project, and it's a really good idea just to kind of think of it in layers. So we've done the arch, we've done the stonework of the arch, pin as you go. Once you're happy with it, if you think, actually, yeah, that's fine, put those pins in, and then things don't move around when you're working on the next bit. So arch is done, stonework's done. We're going to stick with the beiges for now because we're going to look at this meandering pathway which comes out from the arch. So I've just added into those beiges I was using for the arch. I've added in the bit of crochet and the bit of nice light beige vintage tablecloth as well from the kit. So we're still sticking with the beiges and browns for now. So just to sort of try and suggest a little bit of perspective, you're going to try and what you want to do really is try and make the path more narrow where the archway starts and have it widen as it comes towards the bottom of your linen. And again, it's an abstract landscape, it's an abstract piece because it's, you know, it's working with textile collage and stitch, but by suggesting things like perspective, it does help kind of bring that composition to life, because you've got a little bit of lovely perspective and sort of depth anyway with the photographic element of the arch. So it's nice to kind of honour that and then just try and put a little bit of that perspective in by bringing this path down so it widens, as I said, as you get to the bottom of the fabric. And that one again is just, we're going to go back to using the back of the scissors. So we're not doing these uniform shapes anymore. We're going to go back to the back of the scissors and start making some wedge shapes, just like we did when we put these pieces in behind the arch when we started off. And for this one, you can, instead of sort of doing wedges that go from thick to and taper off to thin, you can do more sort of solid strips if you like. If you really weren't sure about doing lots of little strips, as I've done in mine here, you can see that there's quite a few little pieces there. You could potentially cut some larger pieces and just put down sort of bigger pieces of beige, and then work other pieces over the top of them. So if I just do some strips to show you, I usually make these strips a little bit bigger, especially as they get towards the bottom of the fabric as well. So they're small at the back, bigger at the bottom, and again that just helps to suggest perspective. And I work from back to front again, so that layering comes back down towards you, and again just helps with the idea of perspective. And there is an element of just, I don't know, kind of enjoying it at this point. Just enjoy the faff, enjoy cutting those little strips of fabric out, and just enjoy the arranging. I think that's the nice part of this. You know, it shouldn't be, it shouldn't feel like a stressful project. It should just be something that you can enjoy, you can pick up and put down. Little bits of crochet are quite nice as well. Just that white on white, or you could even overlap it with some of the Hessian. So I'm getting into sort of slightly bigger pieces as I'm coming towards the front. I mostly use the beiges for the path. Just tearing that away. Put the last bit in there. The Hessian adds quite a nice texture. It does tend to fray a little bit as well. It just depends on how much texture you want in your piece, really. Just have a little play around. I'm going to use the last of my grey beige there to put a slice in there. And again, I would pin that down. But if you prefer to use the glue, go for it with the Pritt stick. Now you could just carry on with your collage. You could start on the next bit, which is putting all of the greenery in. But again, it's a project that has lots of little bits in it, lots of layers. And I think just to kind of make it a bit more user-friendly, if you like, what I would suggest is that at this point, we tack these pieces down so we can get rid of the pins and then we can put the next layer on, because otherwise we end up with lots and lots of bits of fabric. And that can just become, you know, a bit sort of overwhelming in the sense that there's loads of pins and there's loads of bits to catch in. So what I would suggest now is you take the white machine thread that's wrapped around one of the little T cards in the thread envelope, and just take a little bit of that and do some stab stitch, just to get these pieces in place that we've tacked down with pins. Now when I talk about stab stitch, what I mean is it's a simple tacking stitch. So do a couple of stitches in the same spot in the back of the material, and that anchors the thread in. It's too thin to tie a knot, so do sew a couple of stitches into the back of the bump, and then push your needle through to the front of the fabric. So stab stitch, because it is just a tiny stab, little pin prick of a stitch. So I'm going to go in close to where I came back from and just pull the thread through, and then come up about an inch away and do the same thing again. And I'll just do that through all of the bits that I've pinned in place. It's a little kind of extra job, but I find it really useful because sometimes you can't see your collage clearly for all the pins that you've got in it, and then if you do loads of collage you end up with so many pins in there that it's it just gets really awkward to work with. And you'll find as well, if you were to leave all the pins in and then start trying to do hand embroidery, you'd probably end up getting wrapped around the pins very, very quickly, which is equally frustrating. So this is a great way, as you go along, once you've stitched it, ditch the pins out, and then it just makes your work, you know, a little bit easier to see, a little bit flatter and ready for the next stage. that's all of the stab stitch done on those layers now. So the next thing we need to do is start adding some green, and this is where it gets nice because now you can start really getting some colour in on top of those beiges. One of the first things I did with this was I got this this mid green and just cut a little sliver of it and put it across the top of the arch, because there is greenery on top of the arch, different times of the year, there's sort of grasses and things grow there. So I just cut the tiniest little bit off the top because this one frays quite nicely. And just, if you just run your fingernails along it, so it starts to come apart a little bit, it's quite a nice one that you can just, you'll be able to stitch that down later on. Now the next thing I did as well was I put the tree trunks in, because you do have these things that sort of grow just up along the side of the arch but don't actually cover it too much. And I used the sort of the wool tweed for that. And I just cut just thin little strips. And the reason we put these in first is that so when we do add in the collage, we can sort of cover it. We can cover these tree branches so they don't look like they're sticking in from the side. We can add, you know, little bits of green collage here so it's a little bit more blended in. Now you have got a bit extra light green cotton and dark green cotton, and you'll notice there's also an extra piece of bondo web in your kit as well, the smaller square that was underneath the thread envelope. Now that's so that we can cut and bond the leaf shapes on this side, because these are really easy to cut out of the green and the fray, and that gives a lovely texture. But these ones here are a little bit more fiddly, so I've added a bit of extra bondo web in this kit so that you can bond them down, you can iron them in place, and you get a really lovely clean cut. So just make sure that when you are doing this bit here, you've got a little bit of green left over for these bits at the side, because that's what we'll use the bondo web for. So I'm going to put that to one side and start the green. And the green again is works the same way as the path really. We want to try and give a sense of perspective, so things are slightly smaller in the background and slightly bigger as they come towards you. So that might mean that the pieces are actually bigger. We'll sew the plants in bigger later on. That gives another idea of perspective. But if you've got things in the photograph, try and pick those out and work with them. So there's a big green bush here, and that's one of the first things I start with. And again, just using the back of the scissors and cutting those rough shapes. So I'm going to start from this end. It doesn't have to cover the whole of the photograph. I think sometimes it's quite nice to see little elements of the photograph coming through. I've made that just probably a little bit too raggy. So I'm just going to start by adding in those shapes. I've got a little bush there. And again, just cutting those little wedges and laying them down and over. And try and put a little bit of pattern in there as well, because that just makes it quite, it's quite nice. Just little pops of colour really lift it, because it's a very green collage, this one's a very green composition. So just those little pops of print and colour really make it, give it a bit of interest and give it a little bit of a lift as well. And you can make these bits bigger. I think I have a tendency to work quite small. But you can, you can make the actual slices a lot bigger if you want to. You can cut out some little leaf shapes. So I'm going to put some leaves in here. And can you see now I'm going to start hiding that tree branch. Just little groups of 3 always look really nice. So if you've got some leaves in there, just 3 leaves. Just tuck those in, and you can see how you can start to go from back to front, and it starts to build up. I'm just trying to make sure that you keep a little bit of the green for the leaves on these branches as well, but that doesn't take a huge amount, to be honest with you. And just layer them up one over the other. And it's at this point as well, you could even bring in some little bits of crochet, because little bits of white crochet might suggest little, you know, wildflowers, things like cow parsley and stuff that might grow that time of year. If you're looking at sort of summer scenes. So just a little sliver along the bottom, and then you can see how one side very quickly picks up. I've got quite an interesting bit there actually, which is a nice little scrap. But do keep a little bit for the leaves. And it could be that you even just cut a small sliver off each one for the leaves. And really just something, you know, about 4 centimetres across, just a strip that big is enough for the leaves. If you wanted to cut that and just put that to one side, you don't need a lot. So I'm going to carry on with this now and then talk a bit more about the leaves. If only we could cut and lay and pin it all in real time that quickly, eh? As quick as a time lapse. So I've still got a little bit of green left, a little bit of hessian. I did start adding in little bits of hessian as well, where I had little gaps with where the path was. So you can always, you know, sort of tweak as you go along as well. But I've saved a couple of pieces of green, and they're going to be for my leaves on this side. And then I've still got a little bit of green left for the leaves on this side as well. Now the leaves on this side, I just cut freehand. So I think I've done like just half a dozen little ones. And they don't have to be in this colour. I mean, these are the colours I've used, but you know, you could mix it up. You've got the hessian there. You've got the beiges as well if you wanted to do different seasons. Or you could do mostly dark green. You could put a little bit of hessian in there. These really are your kits, your creations. You could even, you know, if you're a keen sewer and you have some of your own lovely threads and fabrics at home that are really special to you, you could add in those as well, and that just makes the whole experience a little bit more personal as well. You know, you've got your own lovely items and bits and bobs in there. So this side, the leaves are just hand cut. I think actually I might extend this branch up just a little bit as well. So I'm just going to take that branch up and off the piece. So I can hide that just behind this leaf. I'm just going to continue doing these leaves quickly. And then I'll show you how to do the bonded leaves. And then that is the collage finished, and we'll be ready for some creative embroidery. That's those leaves done on that side. And I put them in groups of 3 because I think that just makes quite an interesting composition. And I've sort of tried to get the tree to sort of go off the right up to the edge of the base fabric, and just mixed in a little bit of hessian and a little bit of that mid-green colour as well. But yeah, little groups of 3. Again, if you really want to pin them, you can. If you want to Pritt stick them in place, you can. I'm going to pin those ones in just a minute. So the last thing to do is just to put these leaves in on this side. And again, it's an abstract landscape, so it's a suggestion of leaves, and you can put these in and then you can work stitch over them as well to really fill that area up with green, because it's quite a busy side of the quarry wall, that side, when it's when it's in full bloom. So if you take the second piece of Bondo web that you had, the square piece that's in your kit, just for my demonstration, I'm just using a couple of scrap pieces that I had, again, because I just don't like waste. So I just thought I'll use the smaller pieces, and then you have the nice square piece cut in your kit. But if you cut that square piece down, and cut it just so it can go onto the back of a piece of your fabric. So you don't want it to overlap, because then it'll stick to your ironing board. So just cut it down. You're going to use it almost like a big piece of double-sided sticky tape. So I've got my green for the leaves I'm going to use up here. And I'm going to iron the Bondo web on, remember, with the shiny side facing down, so that your iron goes through the back of the Bondo web and glues that Bondo web onto the back of your fabric. So leave that Bondo web on. I'm also going to do that with a little piece here as well. So I'm just going to cut a small sliver and pop it on the back. So shiny side facing down, just give it a few seconds with an iron, and that keeps that in place. But keep those bits of paper on. And the reason that you keep those bits of paper on is because if you take a pencil, you can now draw your leaf shapes on the back. So I'm going to do little sort of clusters of 2 on the back of the printed one. Keep them quite close together, because that way you make the most of the Bondo web. And then on the back of here, I'm just going to do some oval shapes. And you'd be surprised at how many you can actually fit on in a small space. That's the great thing about Bondo web, because it's got this paper backing. You can draw, and then you can cut and bond your drawings. So I'm just going to cut these leaf shapes out now. So what you've got now, you've got lots of leaf shapes that are cut, and they've got paper back Bondo web. They've got paper on the back, sorry, they're backed with Bondo web. And what you need to do is just carefully peel that paper backing away and pop the shiny side down onto your collage, wherever you want them. So I tend to do them towards the tips of the tree, so it looks like the leaves are hanging down for these printed ones. Yeah, I'm just gonna give that a quick press. And the nice thing about having the Bondo web on the back is you get these really lovely clean shapes, and they're bonded in place. So these are now all been bonded in place. They've just been pressed with an iron. So they're all stuck down without having to be pinned and stitched in place. But you can see I've just popped some pins now on this side where I've got those lovely textured leaves. And the next thing to do is to take your white machine embroidery thread again, which is wrapped onto one of the little tea cards, and just stab stitch everything in place now that's green that you've just done. So once that's been stab stitched in place and you've got rid of the pins, that's the bones of it together. That's your collage ready to be hand embroidered. And that's the really fun bit as well, because then you get to do as much or as little stitch as you like. Again, the beauty of having the stab stitch in place is that you can choose where you want to put your hand embroidery. If you don't put hand embroidery on a piece, it's not going to fall off because you've already stitched it in place. So you've done a good chunk of the work at this point. This is how you get the bones of it together. You could also do things like, if you've got little white pieces shown through where we've done the quarry pieces, the quarry wall, you could cut that little bit of white away, so you get a really interesting edge. It doesn't always have to be straight. You could have pieces going over the edge as well. I quite like a rough edge and a raw edge. Or you could just give them a little trim and make sure that they're, sort of all vaguely in line as well. The next thing is hand embroidery. You've been given 6 stranded embroidery cottons in your kit from these skeins here. So you've got 1 metre of each colour. For most of it, I tend to use just 1 strand of the cotton. I use 2 strands as I get closer to the front of the piece, to the bottom of the piece, because again, that's the part of the arch, part of the scene that's closest to you. So by having the thicker threads at the front again, and thinner threads towards the back, just 1 strand as opposed to 2 strands, it helps to give you that sense of perspective, just to add to that idea that this is a walkway that you can go through. So thicker things at the front, and then from there on I tend to use just 1 strand going back up, because it's quite a small composition. So if you were to use 2 or 3 strands of this thread when you're sewing, you'd find it probably quite thick and quite clunky. So I think just 1 or 2 strands on this size composition works well. It's enough. If you haven't worked with 6-stranded embroidery cotton before, it is really nice. It's a lovely floss that glides through the thread, through the fabric, and it's really easy to split as well. So just a little tip as we go through the video. If you take off some of the thread from your card, that it should be all wrapped around your card in your pack. Just move these out of the way. And you split it between your forefinger and thumb. You'll realise that it's made up of 6 strands. Gets its name from that. Now the temptation when you split this, if you wanted to take 1 or 2 strands out, for example, is to pull either side. But what happens then is the thread here starts to twist, and quite often that twist then creates a bit of a knot. So a little trick is to splay the threads out between your finger and your thumb, and instead of pulling to one side, just grab one thread and pull up and lay it down. And then if you wanted to work with two for the stitches in the foreground, just pull another one out and lay it down next to it. And what you find is, because you're pulling up and you're not pulling out, you can take from these long strands without the rest of it getting into an awful knot. So you can just put those 1 or 2 strands back together and thread your needle and you're ready to go. So I always end up my videos on a little talk through about embroidery, because no one wants to watch me embroider this for hours on end, and that's the nice kind of mindful part of it, where you get to go away and add your stitches as you feel. I mean, this is your piece, so each would be very unique, but there are some guides I can give you for how to approach the embroidery. As I say, there are some guides as well, guidance in the instructions, and there's a stitch guide in there as well if you're not familiar with some of the looped stitches or the French knot stitches as well. So I tend to start off with one of the browns, and I work almost as we collage. So I work from the arch and the stone first. So if I can bring this up and focusing on it, I use a single strand, and you'll see that actually, although there's lots of stitching in there, it's really simple stitching. It's just a running stitch. So I tend to overstitch the edge of the photograph. That just helps to keep everything in place. There's a little bit, if I can do that in the light, there's a little bit of running stitch in the background through the arch, and that's just the lightest beige on white. And that's just to give an impression of sky, but you can see that because you've got the bump behind, you do get like a little bit of texture, which is quite nice. So a little bit of running stitch on the arch. Around the stone, just to help give the idea of bricks and mortar, I've got these stitches, which are just done in the beige and the light brown. And I just do those at a sort of a random horizontal and vertical lines at right angles to each other. And again, it's just trying to emphasize that there's something man-made in here amongst all of this organic material. So this is where the lines are a little bit, you know, a little bit more uniform, a little bit straighter, and it goes right up all over these little brick areas as well, just to add in that little, just the idea of brick texture. I'm a big fan of using stitches as if it was, say, a pencil line. So if you were going to shade something or add a little bit of line detail on a drawing, just do the same thing with your needle. I think you don't have to get bogged down in really, really complicated stitches to make an interesting piece. So up here you'll see where I've got all of the leaves that Bondo webbed on. I've just got some seed stitch in amongst them, and that just helps to kind of fill in or almost colour in some of the area around the leaves and just make it feel a bit more green, if you like. Further down here you can see seed stitch comes in again on the green. So you might want to use green on green, like the dark green on the green fabrics, but you can also use contrast colours, and that's where they really stand out. So I've gone with the mid green, which is a bit more limey, on the light green fabric, and then I've gone with one of the lighter greens onto the very dark green fabric. So just creating that contrast is really nice. And that's the first thing I do once I've done the arch and the stone, is then I start to go down and just do a little bit of seed stitch. And again, that just helps to really get everything down that you've stab stitched in place, and you'll find you start getting a bit of texture again because you've got the bump behind you. I realise the light's catching a little bit there, but you can see I've just done some running stitch on the path, and the running stitch really helps again with the idea of perspective, that you've got something that meanders through the arch here. So the running stitches get a little bit bigger as they get to the front, and they get smaller as they get to the back, and there's even a little bit of seed stitch on those little bushes there, and just some long stitches just to suggest grasses. Again, using the thread as if it's a pencil mark, so you can change the sort of the length of each stitch to suggest grass. There's a little bit of fly stitch, which is mentioned in the instructions, how to do some fly stitch, but that's a lovely way just to suggest grasses as well. And you can see I haven't stitched every bit. I don't have to, because that's stitched down already. Little bits of crochet that just offer a little bit of pop of white there as well. And there's a little bit of chain stitch just in amongst these leaves, just here, just through there. And I've used it again on this big bush, just to try and give a little difference in sort of texture. And we've got chain stitches again up here on these leaves in pink, and that's just to suggest those flowers. And you'll see, because these leaves are bonded down, they only have one stitch going through them, and that's a little bit of a decorative element, but also just to help secure that Bondo web in place, make sure nothing moves. And I do the same with these leaves as well, because these are really textured on this side. So that's just one stitch running down the centre of the leaves. And those are just stitching at the top. There's a little bit of running stitch in the sky, again, just to mirror this bit under the arch. So we've got a little bit of texture there. And one of the last things I do is French knots, because I always think French knots are lovely and textured, and that's kind of my, yeah, it's my finishing touch to add the texture on top, I always think. So with the dark green thread, I do some long stalks for flowers. So can you see again, they're getting smaller as they get further back, but they're getting quite long at the front. And again, that's just another little thing that can help to suggest perspective. So you've got really big, tall wildflowers at the front, slightly smaller as you move further away through the composition. And they're just topped with some little yellow French knots. Some beige in there, a bit more yellow, and some pink down here as well, and a few little spots, little clusters. French knots look great in groups, and it's a great way to add texture. But also by bringing a little bit of pink down here, you mirror what's going on up here, so that just helps to balance the composition a little bit and brings those little pops of colour out. And I've also put some French knots on the pathway as well, just to suggest that lovely gravelly texture that you get on the path as you're walking through the arch at Belsay. But there are plenty of colours and threads in there. As I say, I use one strand for everything except when I start doing French knots and these bigger flowers at the front. So the embroidery really starts to add a little bit of an extra dimension of colour, but also extra textures to all of the lovely textures that you've already collaged and stab stitched down. So I realise this video tutorial has been a little bit longer than they normally are, but it is quite a layered and involved project. But the main thing is I hope you enjoy a few hours of happy sewing, you know, working on this project, working through the layers of it. I'd love to see what you make. You can leave me a like if you've enjoyed the video. I always welcome comments and try to respond to them as well. And if you would like any further support or a little bit of advice, or you'd love to, you know, show me what you've made, you can contact me on my contact form on my website, which is on the back of the kit box, jessicakinnersleytextiles.com. But I will sign off and leave you for now and say happy sewing.